Hi, everyone. I'm Alea Liano, Community Coordinator of CoMotion Labs. For those of you that are new to us, CoMotion Labs provides a multi-industry lab system hosting startups inside and outside the UW community in life sciences, biotech, and health tech, medical devices, robotics and hardware, software, IT, and fintech. Our startups range from pre-seed to Series A, employing 2 to 15 people each, and are variously headed by students, faculty, and community leaders with both new and seasoned entrepreneurs represented. While we wait for everyone to log in to this meeting, I'll make a few announcements. Next week, Margis Bogley, Partner and Creative Director at Nonfiction Design Studio, will discuss sustainability in hardware, how and why. All these presentations are available on our CoMotion website and under labs and startup training videos. We have covered a variety of topics over the past several years, so if you find yourself with some free time, check out these past talks. For our full schedule and to register for future fundamentals, please visit comotion.uw.edu/events. This year, we are proud to partner with Bluetooth to support the Fundamentals for Startups program. To see how Bluetooth audio sharing is poised to once again change the way you experience audio and connect with the world around you.
Bluetooth introduced the world to wireless audio. Calling, listening, watching, making us safer, more productive, more joyful. It's part of the fabric of our lives. Now, Bluetooth will bring us even closer to each other and our world with audio sharing. It will let us share with others our music, our experiences, listening and watching together. The places we go will share with us, enriching our experiences, helping us hear our world. Breaking down barriers between interests, cultures, generations. Introducing Bluetooth audio sharing. Closer together.
Today, Kim Boo is here to discuss creating an inclusive culture from day one. Kim is the global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Remitly, a fintech company serving over 3 million immigrants throughout the world to conveniently, safely, and securely send money to their families across global borders. Kim has been in the financial services industry for over 20 years as a banking executive with credit unions and Fortune 50 banks. The first half of Kim's career was spent building and growing new lines of businesses. The latter half has been dedicated to scaling the social impact of financial institutions, developing and leading corporate social responsibility and ESG strategies, including how companies build trust and rapport with customers and communities, as well as empower and engage employees. Kim has been featured on Yahoo Finance, The Financial Times, GeekWire, Seattle Business Magazine, and Silicon Valley Business Journal for her contributions to the community and championing diversity in business. Kim will take questions via chat. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will now turn the event over to Kim. Thank you.
Hi, Alea. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'll go ahead and jump right in. So let me go ahead and make sure my screen is up. Great. So I think before we get started, I'm really excited to be here. So thanks again, UW and CoMotion, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. But before we jump into the topic at hand, I wanted to be able to just talk a little bit about Remitly. You heard a little bit about what Remitly is in my introduction, but to really just talk a little bit about our vision and our mission, because I think it's important to kind of help set the stage in terms of how we thought about DEI from the beginning as a team of three early on, and have since grown since then. So I want to kind of give you a little bit of that journey to give a little bit more context. But the vision of Remitly is to transform the lives of immigrants and their families by providing the most trusted financial services on the planet. And our mission every day, all of our employees who work directly with our customers around the globe to really tirelessly deliver on our promises to immigrants around the world, to be able to make sure that they can send money home to their families. We were founded in 2012 right here in Seattle, 8 years ago, to really try to create a reliable and more convenient and safe way for our customers to be able to send money home to their families around the world and really give them that sense of peace of mind. We started out with being able to create pathways for digital remittances for customers from the Philippines to send money home to their families. And so many of immigrants make those tough decisions to leave their families in hope of finding work elsewhere to be able to send money home to their families. And so making sure that we could be able to do that in a seamless way was really important. And why we picked the Philippines is one of the facts about the Philippines is about remittances accounts for about 10% of their GDP annually, which is huge. So that just kind of gives you a context in terms of what the opportunities are on a global scale, and what the impact that immigrants have on their home countries in terms of the funds that they send home to really support their families wherever they're coming from. And then just to kind of give you a sense of the big picture, remittances business has historically served immigrants who have generally been left out of the traditional financial systems as we know. And so for us to be able to serve them in that way is really trying to think about what does financial inclusion look like, and how do we create more equity within these systems that have historically left them out of the financial services offerings, as well as being targeted for fees and charges that should not be there, right? And so really trying to think about how do we do that, and how do we streamline that and bring those savings back to the customer, so more of the money that they send home get to their families. So today we serve over 3 million customers, and they can actually send, this list is actually not the most up to date, but we can now send, our customers can now send money from over 20 different countries, and they can actually send to over 80 different countries around the globe. This is all work that we've done over the last 8 years to really try to grow our platform and our solutions. And just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like, just our business alone accounts for less than 1% of the global remittances business, which accounts for about $529 billion, according to the World Bank, and that continues to grow over time. And we've actually seen that increase as a result of the recent global pandemic, because traditional systems of being able to send money home through physical locations like Western Union and MoneyGram are no longer available because they were unsafe. And so many customers, especially new customers, have resorted to using resources like Remitly to be able to safely send that money home and be able to continue to send that money home. And then just to kind of give you a sense, you know, we started here in Seattle and have since grown to be all over the globe. And this just kind of gives you a sense of where we are located and what our journey has been in terms of how we've grown as an organization. So let's go ahead and just jump into talking about the topic of the day and thinking about how do you think about inclusion from day one, right? A lot of folks think that you have to be of a certain size or reach a certain team size or generate a certain amount of like revenue in order to really be able to start thinking about incorporating DEI into your strategy. right, into your business strategy or into your people strategy. And the reality is that it's never too soon to do it, and it's never too early to start. And actually, it's actually ideal to start thinking about it sooner than later, especially if you are thinking about starting a company or have already, started a company, and the mission of your organization is really socially driven, like Remitly's is. Like, it becomes even more important for you to start thinking about those things and asking those questions of yourself and your investors and your board and all the different stakeholders, which we'll talk about a little bit more deeply. Those types of questions from the very beginning, and really starting to think about how you embed DEI in your culture early on, so that it's far more easier to make those shifts and evolve along with your culture as you grow. Because as we know, for many of us, whether we've worked in startups or mid-sized companies or very large-sized companies, the bigger the company is, the more established it becomes that much harder to start to try to unwind or undo policies and processes and practices and structures that we put in place for our organizations. So the sooner that we can think about that early on, the better that we are as we grow and really start to create really healthy systems as an organization as you're growing. So let's start with, why does it matter, right? Like, I think it's always important to be able to kind of start with some statistics in terms of thinking about that piece of it. And there's always like these two talk tracks about thinking about retention and thinking about recruitment. And it really has a huge impact on the industry, especially if you're building a company that is tech oriented, right? That costs the industry more than $16 billion a year in terms of that turnover. And that attrition rate among breakaway growth startups is about 25%, which is nearly double the tech sector average. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that folks don't feel like they've got those opportunities to really be able to grow and develop at the companies. They feel like they don't have that opportunity to really kind of plug in and really understand what the culture and the organization has in terms of really helping them feel like they belong at that organization. The average, just to kind of give you another sense, the average tenure at a startup is about 1.7 years. And that, while may seem like, oh, that seems like it's a meaningful number, is that a lot of times as you start to grow, you'll want your retention to be longer, right? But then what you'll start to feel, which many companies feel as they start to grow, is that tension between being able to meet the demands of the growing business while the pressure of also needing to hire to fill that business demand, while also thinking about what are the opportunities for your team as they are growing and evolving within your organization, and what opportunities to put them into growth opportunities or leadership opportunities to meet those business needs. And so a lot of times that attrition factor comes into play because the pace of the business is not able to kind of keep up with the opportunities for growth and development with your employees. So trying to keep those things in mind and balancing those things is a common tension that tends to happen. And then you compound that, right, with organizations that aren't putting DEI in their forefront. And that really creates a lot of instances of unconscious bias, and that becomes really prevalent. Again, kind of going back to what I mentioned about thinking about those structures and processes and procedures that you're building out without consciously thinking about how is this actually creating inequities as we build those out. So really thinking about those things and putting those things top of mind. So I think when we talk about DEI at any organization, you have to have some baseline of shared language. And so I think it's really important to start with that what is diversity, equity, inclusion, and having a shared understanding of those definitions. Like, these are very standard definitions of what diversity, inclusion, and equity should look like. And as you think about that at your organization, what does that look like for you at your company, right? Taking into account the mission and vision of your company and your startup, and really thinking about like what do we aspire for these things to look like at our organization. And for kind of the 101, like where we're all kind of starting, diversity is really like that representation for the different identities that exist within a common place, and really thinking about the complexities of what those visible and invisible identities might look like in your workplace or on your team. Inclusion is really being able to create a sense of belonging for those diverse perspectives and identities, both visible and invisible, to be able to thrive in that space, right? And then equity is really that piece around, this goes to that core piece of thinking about structures and systems and policies and practices and procedures that you're putting into place that really create that accountability system, not just for yourself, but for everybody else as you're growing your teams and your company, to really think about how do we make sure that every opportunity that we present to our employees, and possibly even your customers, depending on what your product is how does it make it as most equitable as possible, so that as many people as possible can benefit from unrestricted access to those opportunities within your workplace or within the marketplace, right? So a lot of times when we talk about DEI, it feels very academic. There's a lot of language and a lot of words. What we've done to be able to really help us think about what equity looks like at our organization, and really kind of taking that academic perspective and applying it into the workspace, is thinking about what does it look like in each part of how we participate and engage in DEI within our organization and in our communities. And so a lot of times when you hear about folks talking about DEI, you'll hear them talk about what does that look like when you show up at the institutional level? What does it look like at the structural level? And what does it look like at the individual level? So when you think about it from the business perspective within a small company, at the institutional level is like, how are you using your power and privilege, your voice within the industry and ecosystems that you can influence and impact? From a structural perspective, it's how are you thinking about what does that look like for your company systems that you're starting to build, your processes, your policies that impact the way you operate as a company, how you support your employees, and how you support your customer experience. And then at the individual level is really thinking about, this is where the belonging piece really kind of kicks into play, because we talk a lot about belonging. Everybody says, what's belonging, right? Like, what is that? It's the feeling piece, right? The piece that someone can actually feel like they actually belong and they have a sense of satisfaction at your company or within your teams. And that's the one-on-one interactions that happen between employees that can impact their growth, their development, and their satisfaction with being at your company. So I like this particular visual because I think it really helps a lot of folks kind of take the last two slides that I just talked you through, which again is a lot of language for many of us. It may be new language, right? But I think the visual kind of really helps everybody really understand what the difference is between what equality looks like and what equity looks like from the perspective of individual equity, and then that structural systemic equity that we talked about. So on the far left-hand side, what you see here is what everybody assumes is what is fair, right? In an organization or in a community or a customer base that you're working with. So that is what equality looks like, when you give everybody the same resource, but it doesn't address individual needs, right? So everybody gets the same size box, but yet not everybody necessarily gets to see the game, right? That doesn't actually change anything. The middle one really addresses what it would look like if you were to address individual equity. And this individual equity really helps to really address what are the things that will actually create those opportunities where everyone can benefit from that opportunity of being able, in this case, to watch the game. Where we as organizations, regardless of size, where we want to aspire to really try to think about it, and as you're thinking about how you're building out, for example, processes for recruitment or processes in terms of development for your employees or manager growth, those are the things that you really want to focus and hone in on the far right here, where it's not necessarily about what are those individual needs are, but if there was something within your process or your system or your procedures or a certain policy that you're thinking about creating, how can you do it so that it actually doesn't impact any of the individuals, regardless of the diversity that they have, to be able to access the same opportunities that you're trying to create or solve for, right? And so I think this is a really great way to start to think about it from a systemic perspective versus the individual perspective, which is where a lot of us start out with. And that's totally natural for us to start at that place. I think it's important to acknowledge that, because we're all going to start with where we're at, right? That's part of the learning journey. But as founders of startups, a lot of times you're thinking about the company itself, and you have to wear these two different hats that you're swapping back and forth. What is the hat of myself as the founder, thinking about the needs of our company and our team, and also that hat of where am I in my own learning journey of the things that I need to learn and know in order to be able to influence and build a company that's going to be really create a culture of inclusion. So let's talk about where we begin. So on this left-hand side, most companies that we see will start with diversity, right? The immediate response from most companies to say, we have a DEI problem because clearly around when we look at our teams, it doesn't look diverse. So it must be a pipeline issue. It must be that we need to recruit better and do more. And so everybody goes to trying to solve for recruitment. Recruitment is definitely a part of the equation that needs to be resolved. But that may not necessarily be the place that you need to start. The next thing that happens is once people and companies start thinking about diversity, then they run into the challenge of inclusion, because now they've brought in all these diverse teammates, and they recognize and realize, oh my God, our culture and our organization and our company is not built to be able to ensure that everybody feels included and that all voices and perspectives are really encouraged, like welcomed, and to thrive here. So then what ends up happening is you see this revolving door, right, of talent that starts to walk out of the organization. And then they look at the equity piece and wonder, through magical thinking, how come we didn't get there? Like, what is this broken system that we're all part of, and not really understanding how to really think about DEI from the beginning. So what I encourage everybody, as you start to think about what that looks like for you and your organization, is to really think about it from what it looks like on the right-hand side, which is starting with equity at the beginning, at the base, making equity part of the center of your work. Because when you start there and recognize that diversity and inclusion, those are just levers that you're using to balance out systems within your company and your organization. So if you start with equity first, you will be able to get closer to what you aspire your organization to be in terms of an inclusive culture, rather than just trying to address diversity and recruitment or inclusion and retention as the solution. Remember, those things are tools. Those are mechanisms to help you get to equity. But if you treat it as if it's like your solution, you'll never get to a place where you can create a truly equitable organization. And so you really have to think about, what are the things that we're doing that aren't equitable today? And then step back from that and say, how do we start to then go back and balance between thinking about the things that really bring in more diverse perspectives and voices and experiences to your organization, and what do we need to do to ensure that everyone with all those diverse perspectives and experiences can really thrive here. So let's talk about who, right? Like, everybody says, you know, like, well, who owns it, and who, like, what are we, like, who should start it? Do we need a DEI person within our organization? You know, what should we be thinking about when we think about who owns this, right? And really, it starts at the top. It starts with you. It starts with the founding team, right? And really think about, like, these are the opportunities for you to kind of think about, like, who are you and what is meaningful to you and why are you in this, right? Like, regardless of the type of company that you're building and what you're trying to solve for, like, think about, like, why is this important to you? Like, why is this so exciting for you to be able to solve this through a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion? What kind of team do you need to have in order to really solve it in a meaningful way that creates more equity, not just for your team and your company, but for the larger context, that larger ecosystem that you're trying to create value for, right? So really being able to ask yourself that question. Ask yourself, like, who is part of your founding team and what kind of lived and affiliated intercultural experiences do they bring to your team today, and how will that impact your company as you grow, right? Who are the senior leaders and the individuals in your pipeline that you're thinking about as you're fast tracking them in leadership, right? Once you start to pick up that pace and start to grow as a company, you'll start to make very quick decisions about, who goes into what roles, who gets influence, who gets power. All those things are things in those moments that if you don't ask yourself to take the pause and say, is this equitable? And how does this impact, the future of our company? Not just from the bottom line perspective or not just from the investor's perspective, but how does this actually impact the culture that we're trying to build? Being able to add that additional question into your process as you pause before you make those really, really impactful decisions around leadership and team growth will really help you keep that top of mind for yourself, right? And then I think it's really important to be able to ask, who are your investors? Who are those independent board members or advisors that you're bringing into your circle? Are they also pushing you and asking you those questions? Are they asking those questions of themselves, right? I think it's really important that we're having those conversations with our investors and bringing on independent board members or advisors that can bring that context to your conversations to really enrich that experience in those conversations around culture as you build out your company early on. And then thinking about who are those other stakeholders, right? There are a lot of other stakeholders, regardless of what you're trying to solve for as a company, that influence your business, right? And make sure and ensures that you are set up for success. So for instance, for us as a company that's in remittances, another large stakeholder for us is other organizations that are in financial inclusion that are also serving immigrants, right? How do we incorporate them into our conversations? How do we work closely with them in community? How are we supporting them? How are we working with them when issues around policy that impact immigrants come into play, right? And so it's like thinking about all those other stakeholders that are also part of our ecosystem and what impact do they have in terms of providing that added context and perspective to the way that we're thinking about equity within our organization. And then, of course, as you're thinking about your team and the founding team, like, who's owning DEI, right? Does everybody agree that each one will make that commitment to own DEI? Is there a particular champion or sponsor that is really invested in this that can really help bring everybody along? Because again, this work does not happen without commitment from the top, and that has to happen. Like, there's no like way to work around that. You have to have that commitment from the top. So let's talk a little bit about like the how part, kind of the implementation, the different parts of that employee life cycle that can be easily like tackled even when you're a small organization. These are the small ways that you're thinking about early on. I'm recruiting folks or I'm onboarding folks. How can I make sure that I'm creating great experiences for them that make everybody feel that they belong at our organization? So even in that recruitment process, that while you may not have a ton of, like, you may not even have a recruiter on the team yet, right? Like, you are the recruiter because you're also wearing multiple hats, so you're also recruiting as well. But thinking about where are you out reaching out to find your talent? Like, are you making sure that you're posting to various job sites that would give you more exposure to talent that may not be in your existing network? When you're going through interviews and creating your interview loop and bringing candidates in during that process, are you, for example, like asking folks what their pronouns are, or offering your pronouns of all of the interviewers who will be part of the process? Are you providing the opportunity for candidates to be able to select accommodations that they might need if they're coming on site when it's safe for interviews, to ensure that they're aware of what some of those things might be, to make sure that everybody knows that you are being mindful of ensuring that you're being thoughtful about the actual physical space and environment for individuals. For example, if they may need a prayer room, a place to take that break, or if they might need a nursing room to be able to take in between breaks during an interview. So things like that you need to take into account and make sure that you're thinking about that early on and upfront. All those things are signals that say, hey, like, I'm thinking about the candidate experience, I'm thinking about our employees, and it's really important for them to know that we're thinking about those things and recognize that there is what we welcome the diversity of the different experiences and perspectives that people have at our organization. The onboarding piece of really thinking about what are those inclusive benefits and accommodations, right? Very simple things, like even at the beginning when you may be working in a co-working space, but like thinking about if they have access to, like, for instance, snacks, right? That you offer a range of options that would be able to accommodate for different dietary needs that folks might have that may be related to either personal or religious needs that an individual might have. So just thinking about those aspects as well, in addition to the needs of like extended healthcare benefits like mental health and things like that. And there's lots of different services that are available that are affordable or potentially even free, to be able to offer and provide employees and let them know that they have those things available to them, even when you're a smaller startup, but that you're thinking about those things in terms of making sure that employees have access to things like mental health resources. And then in terms of development, I know a lot of times when you're just trying to build and grow a company, you're not necessarily thinking about how am I making sure that I'm also growing my employees individually, one-on-one, and making sure that they know where their career pathway is. Even early on, you can be having those conversations, right? Like you can build those things in with 15, 30-minute conversations, say like, hey, like, I know we're building and we're wearing a lot of different hats right now, but I also want to know, like, what are you thinking about a year or 2 years from now? As we grow this company, I want you to be here, right? So let's make sure that if there are opportunities that are interesting to you, that I'm aware of what those things are, so that we can make sure that we position you for the visibility into those projects or into the things that we're doing as we grow. So those conversations are so critically important, even when you're a small team. And so the development part, I think, really can help you address the pieces around retention and thinking about that length of stay, and really extending that length of stay for employees within a startup space. And then thinking about the retention piece again, right? I think thinking through your promotions process even early on as you're building that out, what does that look like? How will you document that process and make that transparent to your employees? How will you start to think about compensation as well? And how do you walk through and make sure that you're building out a compensation model that's fair to market, that employees have visibility to, so that they can really understand that where they're at and what the opportunities are for them for growth in those pay ranges depending on their job, right? So transparency around that is really important in terms of retention. And then really start to think about, as again, going back to that development piece and the retention piece of, as people grow, it's not just about growing upwards, but also growing laterally, right? A lot of times when we're in startup world, it's such a great opportunity to move laterally, to learn all the parts and pieces of an organization and start to really build up your business acumen. And so really trying to identify where those things are and understanding those different aspects of development will really also support retention as part of everybody's growth process at the company. And then the other piece that I think that gets talked about quite a bit are ERGs, employee resource groups, or DEI councils. And depending on the size of your company, if you're a smaller company, maybe the council is going to be 2 or 3 people that start a committee that's kind of really honed in and focused on it, along with one of your co-founders as one of the champions or sponsors of that council, that starts to really kind of think about how do we create checks and balances for ourselves as we start to build out these policies and these procedures for ourselves as a company. Who's really checking on us to make sure that we are being equitable as we build out our company and start to grow as an organization. And then and the other piece I think that is really important about this part about retention as well is thinking about the social events and activities that you do to really pull everybody together, and being really mindful of people's ages, lifestyles, and personalities as you build that out too. Like, one of the things that we've started to kind of reframe and rename are happy hours, right? Like, not everybody is inclusive of a drinking culture, right? And that tends to be something that has been normalized within startup cultures, like happy hours and getting together for beers and things like that. And there's a lot of aspects of that actually exclude a lot of people, right? And so kind of really thinking about how do you reframe those social activities and engagements that make it inclusive for everyone, regardless of gender or regardless of whether they partake in those specific activities of drinking, for example. So when we talk about when do we start? Earlier I said it's never too early to start, and it really does not matter the size. These are just some of the, I think, examples of things that you can do today, regardless of the size of your team, in terms of thinking about that. And one is, like, you can create a founder's commitment to DEI today, regardless of the size of your team, right? To say at what points, as we grow as an organization, that we're going to commit to certain investments as we grow as a company, right? You can do that now. You can do that now in terms of when you're thinking about that interview process, going back and how we talked about making sure that we're, sharing things about ourselves, like our pronouns, with candidates, and asking for candidates' pronouns as part of the interview process. But also, I think a lot of things that are really helpful to you is, in addition to asking questions during an interview process that are about, that help really demonstrate a candidate's experience or skills, also including questions that really help them tell stories about how they demonstrate inclusive leadership, or how they show experience in intercultural curiosity or leadership around that piece of it, right? And so really being able to incorporate it so that not only are you bringing in strong candidates who can do the job, but you're bringing in strong candidates who can do the job and are going to be visible in your teams and as your company grows as an advocate and a champion to DEI within your organization. And then another thing that you can do is, like, as part of that founder's commitment to DEI, is maybe set a date for when you want to hire a diversity lead or a manager or a director, or even take advantage of resources that are available to you. For instance, the WTIA just recently created the Racial Equity Pact in Tech, which provides resources to startups and small to mid-sized companies that may not have a diversity leader or manager within their organization, but serves as a resource to contract out to small to mid-sized companies to be able to provide that added support. And so they're actually in the process of hiring a chief development or a chief diversity officer right now for the WTIA, which will serve in that function to support smaller startups and smaller tech companies where they may not necessarily have the resources to be able to provide or hire a diversity lead or manager in-house. And then, of course, join the community to learn and share best practices. Obviously, you're getting access to it here with UW CoMotion, but there's also additional communities like the Tech Inclusion Summit, which is another great place to connect and plug in to really learn from what other companies and other startups are doing, which are very helpful. And then, of course, model the way and walk the talk, be authentic, humble, curious, and be vulnerable about your own learning journey. Like, that is the start to really rich, constructive conversations, is you as a leader, as a founder of an organization, being open to your own learning journey and sharing that and walking along the way, along the path with your teammates as well, and really visibly showing that commitment through that process. And really think about the other piece that you can do right now too is, how does it show up in your product or customer journey? Like, it's really important for you to think through that and think about what that might look like as you start to further invest in DEI in your startup. And then I wanted to just wrap up on just providing you with some resources. And these are just some early starts. There's so many different resources out there today. All you have to do is kind of Google it and search through the number of resources that are available to you that are free and at your fingertips. But one of the things that I think are really important to be able to do as you create an organization of inclusion is being able to create a brave space that allows for constructive, crucial conversations to happen on your teams and within your organization, and really creating a culture that allows you to be able to make mistakes and fail, right? We talk a lot about failure of product or failure of companies, but we don't talk about like failure of like messing up when you're having conversations about things you don't know about, right? In between one another who have different lived experiences, being able to create space so that everybody can learn from one another is really, really crucial. So being able to create a really strong inclusive culture is being able to create an environment that allows for that to happen, right? And that empathy and learned experiences are really part and embedded into the culture of your organization, and that it's not just about learning from our losses or failures from the customer or the product journey, but also from those interpersonal interactions and relationships that we have with one another. And so this is just a start of some resources that can help you as you grow. There are resources under partners that are more paid resources, but these are wonderful resources that have been really helpful to us as a company, specifically Crescendo, which provides micro learning moments on employees through Slack. And so really great startup out of Techstars that we have been using for a while now, and our employees have found a lot of value in being able to have that continuous learning tool and a space for everybody to be able to receive content and then share that amongst each other and have conversations with teammates about that. And so think about those things as you're starting to build that out. And then finally, I just wanted to end on this quote before we jump into questions, is this amazing quote that I think is really important that we keep into the context of the work that we do every day, is that not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So while topics of diversity, equity, inclusion within our companies, within our organizations, within our communities is not easy, right? But we can't change anything unless we have the courage to address it and to face it. And so I want to leave you with that as something to consider as you're thinking about that as part of your culture building at your companies. I'm going to hand it back to Alea.
Thank you, Kim. That was awesome. We have some time for some questions, and one question is, how can lower level employees encourage their leadership to create a more diverse environment?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that you can definitely do that is being able to create, like, if your company has spaces where you have maybe town halls or office hours with co-founders or leaders of your organization, be able to can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. The screen changed, sorry.
Oh, it's
Threw
okay.
me off.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I left off, but so I might repeat myself a little bit, but I think there's two ways for you to be able to do it. One is taking advantage of town halls and office hours with your leadership team to be able to share the importance and the concerns that employees may be having about diversity and inclusion at your organization. I recognize that that's not always the safest space for folks. So being able to make recommendations to the leadership team, whether through an anonymous source, able to provide employee feedback, and or through employee surveys. And I think employee engagement surveys are a really, really great place for leaders to be able to access feedback from employees in a place that feels safe for employees to be able to provide that that feedback, and for leaders to be able to access that and then share that back out with employees to be able to hold those conversations.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay, Kim?
I can.
Okay, cool. So from Mike Gleesner, this is great. Remitly has grown so fast based on your early slides. Can you give us an example where you didn't have the see-through fence for everyone to see the game versus one box versus box per need? Boxes per need.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when you think about when you think about that from, I'll use it as a kind of facilities question first, right? And then I'll also share something that's more kind of process oriented. So from the facilities perspective, I think one of the things that have come up quite a bit in the office space, once everybody's kind of back in the office space, is like binary bathrooms, right? So in certain spaces, for some of us, we may have some control to be able to determine how to set up bathrooms so that it is it's equitable for everyone, right? And to be able to put up signage, to be able to create the space to be so that even anybody can use our bathrooms, our non-binary teammates can, our trans teammates can use the bathroom that they feel safest in. So being able to set up the signage to be able to create the space and design for that ability to make it equitable for anyone and everyone to be able to use. Granted, I know that that's not necessarily that accessible for everybody, especially if you're sharing like a co-working space that may not have been set up for that. But that's one of those examples of being able to share feedback to a co-working space to say, hey, like this is something that's really important to make sure that any of our teammates who want to be able to access facilities can be able to do that, right? Another kind of process in terms of what's kind of equal versus what's equitable is thinking about, I'll talk about like the interview process, right? So what's equal is saying, hey, like everybody goes through the same interview process, right? Like we say, okay, everybody, you do a set of loop interviews, right? All day long, back to back, 4 hours, right? 1 hour each with 4 different people. Regardless of scenario situation, this is exactly the same for everybody, right? Everybody walks into this one space. and does the interview back to back to back to back, right? Like that's like being equal, right? That was the example of what was on the far left in the image that I shared. What would be like equitable is being able to make sure, and this is kind of that center picture of like individual equity, is recognizing each individual's candidate's needs and being able to accommodate based on their needs, right? So assessing upfront what are the accommodations that they need and being able to assist them in that way, and making sure that the space itself is set up in a way that where they've got like the room is set up a certain way, table spaces or seats are set up a certain way to make sure that everybody can move about within the room in a way that makes sense for them, right? The systemic example of that would be, for example, being able to just have the room set up so that regardless of who walks into that room, they can use the space accordingly, right? So tables where you're interviewing have like tables that move up and down automatically. So regardless of height or usage, anybody can use that room, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be for a specific individual and their needs, but it meets everybody's needs regardless, right? And that's a very kind of like basic like example of like facilities of like how you use a space, but then also like recognizing all those other aspects of not just the physical space, but ensuring that I think I used the example earlier in the presentation about, is there space for an individual who may need to take a break to use the prayer room or the nursing room, making sure that they have space on the wall to be able to write if they are someone who needs to be more visual versus someone who needs to be more verbal. Right. And so making sure that you have like a room that's set up in like a physical space, so it's set up so that any individual who comes into interview feels comfortable that they can bring their best selves into that interview. Does that make sense? Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Kim. So right now the UW internet seems to be a little unstable, so we'll take one more question.
Okay.
Let's see. So the audio cut out when we were mentioning Slack Learning DEI. Can you give us that name again of the learning tool that was mentioned?
Sure. Yeah, it was called Crescendo. So
Crescendo.
CRESCENDO.
All right. Thank you, Kim. All right,
Sure.
everyone. That's all we have time for today. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your joining us today, and a big thank you to Kim for sharing her wisdom to the group. As a reminder, next Friday at noon, we'll be hearing from Madras Bagley from Nonfiction, who will discuss sustainability in hardware, how and why. Make sure to register for that, and we'll see you next week.